right, welcome everybody. This is the 2025 University of Oregon Wildfire and Smoke Media Forum. My name is Hollie Smith. I'm an associate professor here in our School of Journalism and Communication, and I'm here to moderate and facilitate the conversation today. We are so happy that you could join us, and I'm going to give you a quick run of show before we dive in. So what we're going to do is we are going to do some brief panelist introductions that'll take about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to pose a question to each panelist and let them respond based on their area of expertise. That will take us about another 30 to 40 minutes. And then the rest of the time, we will open it up to journalists to ask questions and try to get through as many questions as we can today. I do want to mention that the forum is on the record, so you are free to use any quotes from the forum today in any stories that are produced. And any questions posted in the chat will be addressed by panelists during our Q&A session. So I'm first going to turn it over to James Johnston for his introduction. James.
Well, hi, everybody. Please, first of all, excuse me for coming to you from a hotel room. And second, I trust someone will pipe up if you can't hear me or I'm coming in or out or so on and so forth. I'm actually just going to talk for 2 minutes or less and turn it over to other folks. I wanted to give you some perspective on wildfire from reading from the Oregonian newspaper. First quote, much of the, and pardon me too, I'm getting over a head cold. Much of the sickness which prevails among us at present is attributed to the heated state of the atmosphere and the immense volumes of smoke ever created by the vast fires. Another quote, we read about Egyptian darkness, but it is smoke, Josephine smoke, smoke in the morning, at noon, and at night. Meet a neighbor, it is smoke. Parting from one, it is smoke. Hogs running around are smoked through and through live running bacon. So you see, we live in the days of smoke. It is smoke, smoke, and smoke. That first quote is again from the Oregonian, September 10th, the year 1864. And that second quote is also from the Oregonian, August 10th, 1867. So it is not just in recent years that Oregonians have sort of lost our marbles over wildfire. These sources really beg the question about how frequent historical fire was in wet West Side forests. It also kind of begs the question of why journalists have lost a certain literary panache in writing about wildfire. My research team and I have done quite a bit of work recently reconstructing historical fire in Western Oregon and found that historically these forests used to burn even more frequently than they do today. We've also done a lot of work quantifying the effect of modern fuel management treatments on wildfire behavior, and so also can speak to ways forward out of the wildfire problem. I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to my colleagues. I'm looking forward to questions and comments from everybody later on.
And James, before we move on to Heidi, James, can you give us your title? Let people know who you are.
I am, well, Heidi will correct me. I'm an assistant research professor at the Institute of Resilient Organizations, Communities, and Ecosystems.
Wonderful. Thanks, James. And we'll turn it over to Heidi Huber-Stearns.
Thanks, Hollie. Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Huber-Stearns. I'm an associate research professor in the same unit as James, the Institute for Resilient, the Institute for Resilient Organizations, Communities, and the Environment, IROC. We have two research programs, the Ecosystem Workforce Program, which I co-direct, and the Center for Wildfire Research and Practice, Wildfire Smoke Research and Practice. So happy to be here. My work focuses on working with communities of practice in place to support learning and decision-making about forest management, fire and forestry, workforce and career development, prescribed fire, smoke communication, community preparedness, and responses to smoke. So looking forward to chatting about some of that today.
Great. And Ellen Peters.
Hey, thanks, Hollie. It's great to be here today. I'm Ellen Peters. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication, as well as in the psychology department. I also have the distinct honor of directing the Center for Science Communication Research, where we try to make science more useful for the public. In my research, what I do is I study the psychological building blocks of how people perceive risks and how they make decisions out in the world. And then I look very specifically at how do those processes link up with effective communication techniques, including in warnings about wildfire smoke. A pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Ellen. And for our last panelist, we'll go to Amanda Stasiewicz.
Hi, all. My name is Amanda Stasiewicz. I'm an assistant professor in the environmental studies program here at the University of Oregon. My research focuses on the human dimensions of wildfire. I do a lot of work in communities related to how we prepare for fire, how we deal with fire circumstances, whether that's evacuation or how suppression occurs in local places. And then also a bit of recovery work related to post-fire flooding and cascading risks. A lot of what I'm working on right now that I find really interesting has to do with the nexus between wildfire evacuations and de-energizations to avoid fire risk. That is a policy that is spreading from California into Oregon and other locations across the Western US and Canada related to de-energizing the electrical grid to avoid electrical grid infrastructure failures during high fire danger. I find that this has cascading consequences for communities. And so that's a big focus of what I'm doing right now. Looking forward to chatting with you all.
Perfect. Thanks, Amanda. So I think we're all here today because we know that this is an important topic for discussion. We know that in the past decade, large wildfires have been increasing across the Western United States and are expected to become more frequent. And also recent reports from the American Lung Association have listed cities here in Oregon, Eugene, Springfield, and Medford as having some of the worst air quality when measured by daily particulate matter in the United States. And we also know that wildfire and smoke are complicated issues dealing with natural, political, and social systems. So the goal of today is to talk about these issues and connect journalists with researchers here at the University of Oregon who have been studying these issues. So I'm going to start by asking each panelist a question that's going to kind of guide our discussion in terms of their area of expertise. So I'm going to go ahead and start with James, and I'm going to ask, James, can you put the current and recent wildfire behavior that we're seeing into historical context? So I love that you brought in headlines from the Oregonian. So can you actually talk to us about what we're seeing today and how that either reflects or doesn't what we've seen historically?
Well, I may have missed my mark. Perhaps I was supposed to share what I shared earlier. Yeah, I'll just say again that the evidence strongly suggests that we, in the historical past, have had more wildfire in Western Oregon than we do now. That smoke is historically really just a way of life for folks living in the Pacific Northwest. That being said, people that lived here hundreds of years ago did have a variety of remarkable adaptations to wildfire, including intentional use of fire to reduce surface fuels and protect communities. One of our major areas of research is the extent to which we could potentially recreate those methods to help keep communities in Western Oregon safe.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? Specifically, what is the role of prescribed fire in reducing wildfire risk?
Well, almost all of what's burning in wildfires is surface fuels. In modern wildfires, we think of trees themselves being consumed by wildfires, but that's actually a tiny fraction of combustion and a tiny fraction of the smoke that's produced by wildfires. Most of what's burning in a wildfire is laying on the forest floor. So what we're looking to do is to reintroduce low severity fire that burns off those surface fuels under controlled weather conditions, or rather under weather conditions that are conducive for consuming that surface fuel without creating fast-moving conflagrations. And doing that in a strategic way around communities is probably the best option for avoiding the tremendous impacts to communities that we've seen in recent years.
From those large, devastating wildfires.
Correct.
Okay. Perfect. And Heidi, I'm going to go ahead and move on to you. So I know a lot of your work deals with the social dimensions. And we're going to continue on this theme of prescribed fire. And I was wondering, can you talk about how land managers specifically, and then also communities, are dealing with prescribed fire and the associated smoke that happens as a result of prescribed fire, especially as our recent wildfire seasons are burning longer and impacting more people here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So building off of what James was talking about the use of intentional fire. So prescribed fire specifically, this doesn't speak to what is often called cultural fire, which is another type of beneficial fire or intentional fire. But with prescribed fire, it can be a really useful tool, as James talked, for addressing surface fuels. It also does create the reality of putting smoke into the air outside of the wild, so often in spring and fall. That varies depending on where you are in the US or in the globe. But at least here within the US, we see mostly prescribed burning happening in the spring and fall, which means that smoke is being intentionally put into the air as part of the consequence of prescribed burning. In those times of year when people are generally hoping to not have as much smoke because they might be seeing it during wildfire season. And so there's kind of a couple trade-offs as far as differences. In one distinct difference with prescribed fire is there is the ability to plan for the smoke. So you will know when the burns are happening, what communities it's likely to affect based on, they know when to burn based on forecasting models that are constantly improving, as well as what communities or areas might be hit with smoke and when that burning will take place and when it won't. And so understanding that allows communities to prepare themselves. So we see increased communication in a couple different places between land management agencies and public health agencies and others to try to figure out how to scale up some of the prescribed burning that is needed from an ecological standpoint, while also trying to expand public health outreach to potentially affected communities to help provide resources and information to people to reduce their exposure to smoke. So an example of this is last year and then this year in Central Oregon, the West Bend Pilot Project was an effort to increase the use of prescribed fire as a tool for forest health. But also it provided this opportunity to collaborate with local public health to do more outreach and air quality monitoring to understand what populations were being impacted. And then again, this year, they're doing a similar thing where last year, the Deschutes National Forest was able to burn 7 times the amount they had generally been burning within the forest in a wildland urban area that was in Central Oregon, near the community of Bend. They were able to increase their burning in that way. And at the same time, public health partners were able to increase their outreach to different populations to help them plan and prepare for the smoke events. And so they're continuing to do that work again this year. We conducted an after-action review looking at some of the ways that the learning from that could be applied in other places where communities are surrounded by forests or national forest lands, and trying to figure out how to coordinate both land management and public health. So that's one example. And then I think the other thing that I maybe would just mention is we also see a lot of communication happening within Oregon, but also other states, like preseason smoke and heat calls, where agencies, like we just had one of these this week in Oregon. Most of the state agencies in Oregon came together to do a preseason heat and smoke call because these events usually occur together, or often and more frequently occur together on the West Coast, where we're having heat domes or other heat events and smoke at the same time. A lot of these households are not equipped to deal with smoke as far as and heat at the same time. A lot of them don't have air conditioning. So having people close their windows during a heat event when they're trying to cool their home, but also to keep the smoke out with their windows closed, is a pretty tricky trade-off. And so figuring out how to navigate these smoke and heat events is another place where we've seen state doing a bit of work, and happy to chat more about some of that as well.
Heidi, I'm wondering if you can actually follow up on one of those questions. So you said some households aren't prepared, particularly for smoke and heat together. But I'm curious, can you talk to us a little bit about the community level, and how can communities plan for this? Or how are you seeing communities here in Oregon plan for increased smoke, either from prescribed fire or wildfire?
So we have, other states have some plans that are similar to this, but in Oregon, given our smoke management plan, there is a specific thing that some communities have within Oregon, which are community wildfire smoke response plan, or sorry, community smoke response plans, which are plans that communities can make in areas that have been designated as smoke-sensitive receptor areas, which essentially means they are more prone to having smoke sit in those areas and affect the population. That's a designation that Oregon Department of Environmental Quality assigns, but those smoke response plans do a couple things. They allow the state to grant exemptions to certain regulations, such as around PM 2.5 standards, so that the use of prescribed fire can be increased in certain areas. But it also supports the use and creation of these community completed response plans that are developed based on a state health authority, created Oregon Health Authority, that helps communities prepare for smoke. So originally they were created for prescribed fire, but they can be used for all types of they were created for smoke from prescribed fires, but they can be used for all types of smoke. So those are models of pre-season communication plans. When a smoke event happens, who will be contacted, where are clean air shelters or resilience hubs or other places people can go, who will be notified, what type of information will they have. All of that information is created in these plans. It also provides some information about the different populations on how they might be affected, who is more medically vulnerable and might need other assistance, where are there areas of non-English speaking populations that would need outreach in other languages. So all of that kind of pre-season planning in those smoke response plans and the way in which it brings people together to create those plans for a community can help them navigate different smoke events.
Perfect. And Heidi, I think if my numbers are correct, about 9 communities in Oregon have those community response plans in place.
Yeah, 9 communities have them. We also see communities looking for opportunities to do this elsewhere. So putting it into other plans like community wildfire protection plans and looking for opportunities to integrate considerations around smoke preparedness into those plans. There's kind of a couple different layers of planning that communities could think about doing this. And those community response plans are all publicly accessible. So it's a template that other places could use as well to learn from, even if they're not one of these designated smoke sensitive receptor areas.
Perfect. Thanks, Heidi. All right, I think that's a great segue into talking to Ellen Peters, who is an expert on communication. And I know you've done some work actually looking at smoke communication. And I'm wondering, can you talk to us a little bit about, number one, who is at risk from wildfire smoke and how people know when they actually need to protect themselves or take a protective action to deal with the wildfire smoke?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. I mean, the question about who's at risk from wildfire smoke, the answer is a little bit easy because it's everybody. Wildfire smoke actually contains a whole set of different compounds that are hazardous to people's health. And that, we hear, I think we hear a lot, particularly because of things like purple air. We hear a lot about what's called fine particulate matter. That's that PM 2.5 number that people will sometimes hear about. But it contains carbon monoxide, methane, trace metals, different carcinogens like formaldehyde. What it means is that particularly at higher smoke levels, there are health impacts of breathing in that smoke, and it can affect everybody. But there are also very sensitive groups or more sensitive groups, and that would be people like children, pregnant people, people who have existing conditions, things like respiratory and cardiovascular conditions. They're all at more risk than the general population. Children, people are often interested in why children are especially at risk. And it's interesting because for one thing, children often spend more time outdoors than adults. So you might remember your own childhood and spending time outdoors. Well, now imagine doing that in the midst of a smoke event. But kids also breathe faster. They take in more air relative to their body weight at the same time as their lungs are still developing. And so they're just a little bit more vulnerable. People who are pregnant, when they're exposed to smoke, that in utero exposure for the fetus has been associated with preterm birth and decreased birth weight, and that has a set of potential lifelong health implications for the child who's about to be born. At the same time, and this is where communication can start to come in, a lot of parents are unaware of these health risks of wildfire smoke, or they don't know how to protect their children, or they just don't take the risks all that seriously. And so part of the research that we've done with, and I have a brilliant postdoc named Kathy Slavik, who unfortunately just left us recently for what hopefully is going to be a faculty position. But with her, we've been doing a bit of research on, how do people know about when to protect themselves and when to protect their families? And part of what we found out is when it comes to things like AQI numbers. Now, you can get an AQI number if you look up Purple Air, for example, or Air Now. What we found is that only about 3/4 of people knew where to find the information. And that information is important because it shows you what that level of smoke risk is at the moment. And it also helps you to interpret the meaning of that smoke risk when it comes to, why does this matter for your health? What we found is that people are more likely to protect themselves when they know where to find those AQI numbers, of course, so they know how to figure out what is my risk level right now if I go outside. So that the first most important thing is to know where to find it. Second thing is to check it frequently, because smoke levels change, and they can change fairly quickly. And then the other things that end up making a difference is, have they had experience with health impacts in the past from wildfire smoke? And then one of the most important ones is, do they perceive risk from smoke? Because you have to perceive something as risky, as posing some potential danger to yourself, before you're going to take action about it.
So Ellen, can you give us maybe some concrete things about what can be done to improve the communication around smoke or air quality in particular?
Yeah, so there are a variety of things. So the whole intention of communication is first to help people prepare ahead of time. This is a bit of what Heidi was talking about. So to help people prepare ahead of time, so they know the kinds of things that can be done and that work, and then to respond appropriately in the moment. So you kind of think about it both ways. And particularly when it comes to that kind of preparation, one of the good strategies to use is to use visuals and stories to motivate the use of these air quality indices. And the reason visuals work is that they capture attention, and they direct your attention to information about warnings that's important. And it can just be a powerful communication tool, because it can sort of grab people on that experiential level. AQIs, things like From Purple Air, are some of the visuals that can be used. And they're especially when people are familiar with them, they work pretty well. But AQIs aren't always familiar to people. They're sometimes very unfamiliar. And parents in particular find them kind of just distant. They're numeric. They're distant from parents' experiences. They haven't dealt with them much. And that's one of the places where stories can really come into play. So stories can help. When you use a story to sort of motivate, why is this important? You can, if you're talking to an individual person, that can help you develop sort of rapport with them. But even if you're not one-on-one with that person, stories can help connect with people's health. They can make the health impacts more real and seem like it's more now and immediate and important. It can make actions that people take more tangible, and make them feel also sort of more personally relevant. And so those kind of personal stories play they play a whole variety of roles that help to increase the importance and the relevance of health messages, but also help people feel more confident that they can actually do something about it successfully.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ellen. All right, so next we're going to turn to Amanda. And so Amanda, you do really interesting work, particularly dealing with, you talked about de-energization, and which is public safety power shutoffs. And so fire, weather, and risk landscapes are generating more challenging prevention, suppression, and evacuation scenarios. So there's an interesting policy nexus between electrical utilities and communities living in these fire-prone areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about your ongoing research, exploring what you've seen, particularly with utilities and communities, and how they are pursuing risk mitigation efforts during PSPS, public safety power shutoffs?
Yeah. So for those of us who are less familiar with public safety power shutoffs, they are instances where electrical companies will de-energize the grid to avoid their infrastructure potentially causing a wildfire incident during high fire danger days. This kind of idea largely originated in California, where in 2017 and 2019, 50 to 60% of all the acres burned in the state were related to electrical infrastructure failure. So anything from line slaps to trees falling on the lines, malfunctioning equipment, things like that. In order to deal with liability, I've started doing de-energizations on days where there are both high fire danger ratings, so like red flag days, but also needing typically high wind events. At least in California. When we start getting out of California, though, now that we're starting to see liability for fires being attached to utilities at times, thinking Lahaina and the West Maui fires a couple years ago, Smokehouse Creek in Texas, not to mention historic fires that are in our memory, the Camp Fire in 2018 in California and Paradise. So we can see that there's this precedent for concern for electrical utilities that are operating in fire-prone spaces. And the question becomes, do we de-energize or not? And in part, the reason we might not want to de-energize has to do with the impacts it's going to have on communities, particularly in rural America. So thinking about how the emergency management groups now largely lean on text alerts that we can all get, just like an Amber Alert or a Silver Alert. If there's a missing person, you get a text on your phone. And in rural America, if you've been de-energized to avoid an electrical company related wildfire incident, you might no longer have cell phone service or internet service that lets you get those alerts. So a lot of folks in rural areas, I can see smaller utility companies largely grappling with this idea of we're only de-energizing as a last resort because we're worried about that communications piece. There's a lot of other things to be thinking about too, which is in more rural spaces, we often are our first line of defense. Our first response is locals taking out their water trucks or just being able to address fires there on their own to protect whether it's their crops, their rangelands, or their homes. And that if we de-energize those areas, we're going to often lose any electrical powered water pumps that would allow us to address that fire before a fire department or a state agency can show up. Additionally, this has overlap too with our resilience to other components of wildfire or other hazards that might be going on in the landscape at the same time that we're experiencing high fire danger. So thinking about our smoke exposure, if outdoor air quality is low and now we've de-energized, we lose our ability to run air filters in our home. If we are a medically vulnerable individual who has a CPAP machine, needs to refrigerate insulin for diabetes, has a climate sensitivity where my symptoms increase when exposed to heat, I might also lose the ability to be safe or have my treatments at home if we've de-energized during fire danger or weather conditions that might go on for days to weeks. And so there's a lot of folks thinking about how do we create more resilient landscapes while also removing this concern of if we were to have an electrical grid failure and have a wildfire event occur, how do we remove that ignition source from the landscape, but also keep communities as safe as possible during high fire danger and high wind conditions?
Are you seeing that utility companies are working with communities to create plans and kind of communication structures? So if there is a time when they actually do have to de-energize, that communities will be prepared, individuals will understand what's going on in that scenario. How are you seeing communities and utilities kind of grapple with some of these complexities?
Yeah, so a lot of the communities, what I'm seeing typically is it comes up one of two ways. You're either seeing utility companies reacting to the precedent that's being set as best practice coming out of California, and also some of the legal precedent that's coming out of the cases that are being resolved in California related to the investor-owned utilities or the IOUs. And often those policies kind of went ahead of communities. They were certainly consulted, especially lobbying groups, special interest groups, but now there's opportunities for feedback because We had to have something come into place quickly to deal with this new risk we saw in the landscape. And now we're adding modifications over time, whether it's through legislation or through the utility companies themselves, actually consulting with these communities, or in my case, guiding some of my research to go and speak with communities they felt they weren't hearing from. In other ways, we see outside of the IOU, the investor-owned utility, or the POU sector, the publicly owned utilities, we start seeing that in a lot of rural America, we do have electrical co-ops. These are community-owned electrical companies that are providing these services who really don't have the extra capital lying around if there was a lawsuit, right? But that's places where we see the members have a lot of influence on how that mitigation plan tends to come forward and what components there are and whether under what circumstances we're going to de-energize. And no co-op is created the same. You have some that are servicing ranchers and agriculture where you see a really low tolerance or low desire for PSPS versus other areas, maybe more suburban, where certainly they don't want a public safety power shutoff because we all want our amenities to work and our homes to work the way we need them to. But they have a higher tolerance for it because their livelihood's not on the line. And so there's those kinds of components coming in as far as like community partnership. An interesting space here is that just like we see in the housing industry, we do see insurance coverage coming up for these communities. So if they're not going organically from bottom up through the whole plan process, it's often because they need to get a plan in to continue their insurance coverage. Yeah, those are the big ways I see communities coming into play. It's either organically through the start of the process or in year 2 or 3, once they've gotten a plan in place to deal with that liability.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and thinking about preparation, kind of tying back to both, what Ellen and Heidi mentioned earlier, thinking about how individuals who are vulnerable to different elements related to these problems, so smoke, heat, and need electricity for certain medical devices or to, purify the air, thinking about how communication and preparation can play a role in planning for these type of events. So there's enough advanced warning so people can take action. All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead, and if we have any questions in the chat, please feel free to put some questions in so we can have a more interactive dialogue with our panelists. I'm going to start with a question from Ashley, and she's here at the Lookout Eugene Springfield. It's great to see you, Ashley. So Ashley has a question both for Heidi and Ellen. Is wildfire smoke considered a public health crisis, especially in places like Lane County, where we have seen an increase in smoke? And I think that Ashley brings up a really good point that we haven't addressed yet. She asks about both physical and mental health impacts from smoke. So I don't know who wants to start, perhaps. Well, let's start with Heidi, and then we'll go to Ellen.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. And then Hollie, it might be good for you to also weigh in on some of the research that you've been doing and looking at risk communicators' perspectives on this. So I will say that, so I can't speak for every place at all times, Ashley, but generally, no, wildfire smoke is not considered a public health crisis. It's something that we've heard from practitioners. The challenge is, for example, when working with an emergency manager and trying to decide if something like smoke meets kind of the criteria of being a crisis, they're weighing a lot of other things at the same time, of course, in public health that actually are either more pervasive, longer term, could impact more people that they're designating as crises. And so the challenge, I think, is that smoke is unpredictable, intermittent, and is frankly kind of competing with other public health issues that are happening at the county level. And I know that we've also heard from practitioners that the other concern is about making everything a crisis, to the point that people might not be paying as much attention when there is like a public health advisory. And so I think these are some of kind of the considerations that we hear emergency managers and others weigh when they're thinking about this. And then I will just flag, yeah, we're seeing more scientific research coming out about the mental health and long-term health effects of smoke exposure, particularly some of the trauma that people are experiencing in seeing smoke repeatedly. It's also one of the challenges with prescribed fire smoke is that people who have lived through heavy or multiple years of smoke events sometimes are triggered by seeing more smoke. And so that's another challenge that we're seeing around some of the mental health impacts. And I'm sure Ellen has other things to add too.
Yeah, so I really what I would say is it may not be considered a public health crisis. It's certainly a public health issue. And it's a public health issue that the counties do take seriously. They do message about it. They do think about it. And so it's an important public health issue that they do pay attention to. It's an interesting question whether it's a crisis or should be a crisis. I hear exactly what you're saying, Heidi, around the idea that everything can't be a crisis. At the same time, as a public health issue, one of the things that tends to work pretty well with wildfire smoke is to make sure that physicians are seeing it as an important issue and that physicians are communicating with their families and patients about it, because they're one of the most trusted sources of information when it comes to health. So it may not be a public health crisis, but it is a public health issue. And by the way, Ashley, it's great to hear your name. It's been a few weeks.
Yeah, and I think
Holly,
Ellen,
do you mind if I add?
No, go for it, please.
I was just going to add one thing on that Ellen made me think of. So some other work that's been done by the California Council on Science and Technology a couple of years ago looked at the kind of linking public health and forest health and included interviewing a lot of public health, mostly medical providers and facilities in California. And one of the things that work found are the ways in which smoke affects, I mean, this is not just public health, but I think it's just kind of another consideration around the way that smoke affects medical facilities. They are dealing with trying to keep their buildings cleaner air spaces for their patients, but also for their employees. They're dealing with limited staff in places where their staff actually can't come in because they're trying to deal with their own family or themselves dealing with smoke. And so they're dealing with both their own employees, their infrastructure, and their patients. And then also, like Ellen said, they're really a critical messenger, particularly in rural areas, for sharing about preparedness for smoke events, what you can do to limit your exposure, and things like that. And so I think anyway, just to underscore Ellen's point, I think we're seeing increasingly that these things are pretty interconnected as far as both the mental health and physical health components and how that smoke is affecting medical facilities.
Yeah, and I think I also want to emphasize for this mental health impacts. So I've done some research with Heidi and others where we're looking at different people who are engaged in smoke communication work. And it's not a standard piece of the protocol to be talking about mental health protections or how smoke might be impacting mental health, but you are seeing a growing number of communicators acknowledging that, and especially during extended smoke events is I think that when you see that happening. And so we have several communities here in Oregon where smoke doesn't just happen for a day, and it's not as intermittent. It might be for an extended period of time. So we have some communities where it's 7, 10 plus days where they are experiencing unhealthy air quality. And that can be just a lot more difficult in some ways because you can't live in a clean air room or a resilience center or something like that. And also thinking about how that impacts children if they are able to go outside for recess or for outdoor activities. And also recognizing that not everyone has the resources to go to cleaner air places. So actually physically leaving the area. So for example, here, I know several people when it's bad, they will go out to the coast or go somewhere else to get a little bit of respite. And that's not always possible. So I think that we are, for the mental health impact, seeing particularly for longer smoke events, that is becoming more relevant and people are trying to address that in their communication efforts. Okay, so we have a question from Zach, and I think this one is going to go to James. So what was the historic role of naturally occurring fire here in Pacific Northwest forests?
Well, it depends entirely on the forest type. Fire played a different role in dry fire, seasonally dry, fire-prone forests of eastern Oregon and southern Oregon than it did in western Oregon. And even in western Oregon, which is typically dominated by Douglas fir, there may be important differences in historical fire between low elevation stands Cereal to Grand Fir or Western Hemlock and higher elevation stands Cereal to Pacific Silver Fir or Mountain Hemlock. But in general, fire would have created a certain amount of habitat heterogeneity. Fire kills trees, and so it leaves patches of dead trees and tends to create a lot of vertical and horizontal complexity in forest stands. Fire would have also reduced surface fuels, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the prime driver of wildfire. In general, our research indicates that most historical fires were relatively small, constrained by the footprint of the last fire. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your questions, but I'll leave it at that for now, and happy to take any follow-up questions.
Yeah, Zach, it would be great if you could put in the chat if that kind of got at what you were looking for, or if you have a different question to follow up with on that. I would like to ask James, if you can speak to this, James, what is the role of prescribed fire with other techniques used to decrease the risk of wildfire? So I'm thinking of thinning and other efforts that are used. Can you talk about how these different kind of efforts work together and what that looks like?
That's a great question. Prescribed fire is often coupled with and preceded by mechanical thinning that removes younger trees, which are less fire resistant, and allows for a greater range of days in which you can put prescribed fire on the landscape, and generally more flexibility for controlling prescribed fire. So in many cases, mechanical thinning preceding prescribed fire is an important tool in managers' toolbox.
Okay, so you kind of rely on both to make that a more effective.
Yeah. And I see another question from Ashley here. She asks, also regarding defunding, what is the future of prescribed burns and fuels management? How does this play into responsibilities of state, municipal, and individual prescribed burn associations? It's another great question. It's a complicated question. There are many barriers to both mechanical thinning and reintroduction of prescribed fire. Important barriers include regulatory barriers, both with respect to planning under, for instance, the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera. There's also, particularly with respect to prescribed fire, important regulatory constraints with respect to the Clean Air Act and efforts to limit smoke emissions. Other important barriers to implementing needed restoration at scale include funding to get this work done, but also just agency capacity and expertise. It's often the case that, a well-trained crew or leader is far superior and can do much more efficient work than new people. And so one of the things that we really need to, the place we need to get to with agencies is a highly trained workforce that has the capacity to do this work. And obviously, recent actions by the administration have been disruptive to building continuity in funding, and also building continuity in agency staff capacity and expertise to get us where we need to be in terms of forest restoration.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, James, thinking about how do you develop, a workforce to accomplish this at the scale that has been recommended. Okay, Ashley, I'm going to go back to another question of yours. So you ask, is individual action, so individual protective action with smoke, more important now or more important than ever during the federal cuts that we've seen recently? So for example, an extreme weather center in West Eugene was defunded. It was funded previously by the EPA. And it would have offered protection from wildfire smoke for the most vulnerable in our community. How can people affordably take steps to protect themselves and their families, especially in older homes that are not weatherized for our new climate reality? So I don't know who wants to take the first go at that one.
I mean, I can say a little bit just about the idea is it more important now? I would say yes. I think that we need to work on building our community action, even in the face of decreased funding for that. But the community actions are going to be important. At the same time that we know that those funding levels have decreased. And what that means is that having good communication that helps people to prepare in advance, and to prepare in advance in ways that first you help them understand what are the risks that are out there. So you help them just understand like how to monitor for those risks when it comes up, so they know where to look. They're not searching last second, that they know where to go for the information. They know that they need to check fairly frequently. And then they know what the actions are that will make a difference, because people are much more likely to protect themselves, to take charge of their own health, if they know that there are solutions that will work, and they have the confidence that they themselves can do it. And so that kind of communication is going to has become and will continue probably to become increasingly important to help people take charge of their own lives.
Yeah, and Heidi, I know you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's a great question, and absolutely there are things that people can do at the individual level, and the reality is that some of what we're seeing right now is having pretty major impact on our ability for communities to be able to prepare for events, whether it's smoke. Those are things like those cleaner air shelters or resilience hubs or other things that we see happening are the same places that people go for cooling centers and heating centers, and also to have power, or to get out of some of those other conditions if they are sitting in them at their own homes, recognizing that there are mobility challenges in getting to some of these spaces. But I don't think there's any way around the fact that is an increasing challenge, and we see smoke and heat and these things co-occurring more and more frequently. So I am concerned about that. I agree that there are things that can be done at the individual level. There's also, not every community, but increasingly in the West, we're seeing there are HEPA filter loan programs that some community-based organizations run, where they're loaning out filters for populations that might be more susceptible to impacts from smoke. We also see other programs where those that are eligible for Medicaid or Medicare are able to get an air purifier in their home. Last weekend, I was at an event in Ashland, Oregon, and Southern Oregon, where they did a DIY filter workshop, where they had funding to bring in fans and filters and teach people how to tape the filter on the fan to make your own filtration system at home. And so sometimes those are no-cost options when you are able to go to these workshops and they have funding. Other times it's a low-cost option, but like Ellen said, having some of that preparedness in place ahead of time really does help when the event happens. And even, to Ellen's point, even understanding when to close windows and doors can make a huge difference. In a lot of places, at least in Oregon, we know where smoke settles, and it's usually at night or very early in the morning. And so even just the action of knowing when to close your windows and doors, when it's possible, when you're not also dealing with co-occurring heat, can make a huge difference in reducing individual exposure to smoke.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point too. And also that smoke isn't something that's going to go away. And so understanding our relationship with smoke and when we should check the AQI, getting in a regular habit of doing that, so we understand not only like when to open our windows and doors, but when we actually can do things that we love to do in terms of going outside for a walk, letting your children play outside, those kind of things. So understanding it takes a little bit more in terms of just checking and planning for those things when it is possible, so you can continue to live while we have these impacts here in the Pacific Northwest.
Could I add something just quickly, Holly?
Yes, please.
I actually wanted to go back to something that James said way, way back at the beginning. He talked about fire as a way of life. And I think that that's part of what early communication can do. It can help people understand that wildfire and wildfire smoke are a way of life for us. And understanding that and understanding what to do about that is just super critical for people, so that they can be healthy across the lifespan.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And if any of you have other questions, we have about 10 minutes remaining in our session, so it would be great to get any final questions that you have into the chat at this point. And I think at this point, too, I would also like to ask each of our panelists to think of if there's one takeaway from today's conversation or you would like to leave journalists with a point, that we'll close with that. But we have one more question from Zach. Can we get a little more on what James just mentioned in the chat? How should state, local, and tribal fire agencies be preparing given the uncertainty around federal response?
It's a multifaceted problem. There's not just one solution. There's a lot of things that local, state, NGO, tribal agencies need to be doing to be prepared for fire season. But I think the two most important are wrangling stable funding for needed work. And the second is developing that, really skilled workforce. So those two things, stable funding and an adequate workforce to get work done on the ground. Hollie, or Heidi, and others probably have better answers than I do on the subject of workforce and agency capacity.
I mean, I can add to that to say a couple of things, and happy to follow up on any of this. A good portion of the work that we do right now is on understanding fire and forestry workforce and career development and kind of challenges and opportunities. But I guess I would add a couple things. So a lot of our suppression work, actually surge capacity for suppression work is done by private contractors in the United States. So we see a lot of federal, state, and other suppression resources, but increasingly we see kind of at those heights of when we have the most resources out on fires is when private contracting crews are most needed for their resources. And so there's a lot of kind of, maybe, I don't know if it's speculation, but a lot of consideration that we might see more of that this summer, given what has happened with the federal workforce and some of the challenges that about within some of the land management agencies around the use of staff and the lot of do. There's also a lot of interconnectedness between who is trained for suppression or prescribed firework, and so losing one can mean losing both. So the kind of the role of non-federal actors and private contractors will probably be prominent this summer. And that comes with its own set of challenges as some of the funding limitations trickle down to those local groups. Happy to chat more about that, but I agree with James. The training is key, the funding is key, and then also it's a pretty diversified workforce that does this work. And so thinking about the different pathways by which people come into these careers and what might help them want to not just stay but advance in this space is something that has been a challenge for a couple decades and is getting kind of more intensified. And so thinking carefully about what that looks like is something we're exploring, and happy to chat more about it.
Perfect. Thanks, Heidi. Okay, so at this time, I'm actually just going to go around to each panelist. And if you have a key takeaway or something that you'd like to just share as a final thought before we end today, that would be great. So I'm going to go ahead and start with James.
Well, the most common question I get asked by reporters is, what are we going to do about the fire problem? And I hope that it's clear from the conversation today that it's not just one problem, it's a series of interconnected problems that require very systematic, multifaceted solutions. In fact, asking, what's the deal with the fire situation is sort of like asking, what's the deal with the economy? It's a pretty big ecosystem of issues that really gets pretty complicated the more you dig into it. So looking forward to talking to you all down the road. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, James. Turn it over to Heidi.
I mean, I love what James said. I would just add to that and say, I second everything James said, and the role, like I was just talking about, kind of the role of local organizations, community-based groups, contractors working in this space, non-federal actors, is whether it's for communicating around smoke or preparation or response or around wildfire, they all have critical roles to play in communication about and implementation of this work. And so I think I would just maybe emphasize that, and that's kind of in the chat as well. That's really a key space that is worth thinking about ways to help support those spaces where we can for forest health and public health.
Perfect. Thanks, Heidi. Ellen.
So I would actually go to the amazing place that we live in and the incredible beauty of the Pacific Northwest that we get to enjoy as a way of life. But with that way of life comes wildfire and wildfire smoke. And so we have this amazing place, but we also have to do things to be able to live in peace in that place. And so as journalists, part of what you can do is you can emphasize the near-term health benefits of people reducing their exposure to wildfire smoke. And you can help people and that'll help to increase risk perceptions in appropriate ways, but also motivate protective action so that they can take care of themselves and their families. And then also within those same pieces that you write about, people need to know that what the solutions are, those solutions will work for them, and they need to have confidence that they can actually do them. And as journalists, that's part of what you can provide to the community.
Perfect. Thanks, Ellen. And Amanda.
Yeah, I think kind of taking from what everyone's been talking about so far, that one of the things living with wildfire brings us to is also this understanding that right now we are increasingly encountering spaces where we're having multi-hazards, right? So it's not just that there's fire risk on landscape, you have poor air quality and smoke, you have heat waves. We can see with the Marshall Fire, the LA fires, that fires are happening outside of normal fire season. And therefore there are communities that, if, for example, in my work with de-energization, if they're exposed, you're talking about exposure to frost warnings and heat waves that kill more people than fires every year. And so that when we're thinking about resilience to fire, we're starting to think about resilience to multi-hazards, and that requires really a community-focused and localized approach. That if we have top-down policies and cookie-cutter solutions, that they're actually not going to work for some of our most vulnerable populations that don't typically show up to meetings where you have to be in suits to talk to politicians. So it's really about getting back down to the grassroots on that to find the most adaptive way forward.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Amanda. Well, I hope this was a useful conversation today in thinking about kind of the historical role fire has played here in the Pacific Northwest, how it's kind of playing out today, the impacts we're seeing with smoke, how communities are preparing and responding to these issues, along with what individuals and communities can do in response to these issues. So thank you again to all the journalists for attending. Again, this was on the record, so you're free to use any quotes for stories today. And please reach out to Molly. She has her email in the chat if you want to connect with any of the panelists. So thanks so much for attending.